welcome back to Vital Signs. Today we are doing an introduction into the body. If you're new here, I'm Professor Thomas. I'm here to give you a crash course on all things anatomy and physiology. Let's start with what those words even mean. Anatomy is what is it? Physiology is how does it work? So if we wanted to simplify that into a one-word association, anatomy would be structure, physiology would be function. Once we understand anatomy and physiology, we can take our knowledge one step further and look at pathology, which is what happens when things go wrong. Pathology is the study of disease. The scientific method is how we approach discovery, and every great discovery begins with a question. We call that question our hypothesis. So for example, I could hypothesize that your name is Karen, but I won't know that my hypothesis is true until I ask you that question. A good experiment will be repeatable, have a test group and a control group. The test group is the one where we don't know what the answer is going to be. For example, if I truly ask you, is your name Karen? I don't know what you're going to say. You could say yes, you could say no. But the control group would be asking someone whose name we already know is Karen, is your name Karen? And they would say, yeah, my name is Karen, right? So we have to have a test group. We don't know what the answer is going to be, and a control group where we do know, yeah, my name is Karen. Once we've repeated an experiment enough times and proved it true time and time again, our hypothesis gets elevated to a status of being a theory or a law. Levels of organization go from small to large. We start with atoms, then molecules, cells, tissues, organs, organ system, and finally an entire organism. Usually if this is a test question, it's an ordering question. So knowing which of those is the smallest versus which is the largest is going to be really important here. If you're new to healthcare or nursing, you'll need to know anatomical position. Anatomical position is what we assume our patients are standing in when we use directional terms. It gives meaning to those directional terms. So in anatomical position, a person will be standing upright, hands at the side, palms forward, feet slightly apart, shoulder width apart. The head is facing forward and nothing else too crazy is going on. The terms that we might be using would be anterior and posterior. Anterior means in front of, posterior means behind. How I remember this is if you are about to step on an ant, it is in front of you. Whereas if you're leaning against a post, it is behind you. We also have words like supine and prone. Supine means lying face up, prone means lying face down. How I remember this one is if you are lying on the floor face up, you could eat some soup. But if you are prone face down, you cannot eat soup. There's also superior and inferior. Superior means above, inferior means below. Medial and lateral. Medial is towards the midline, lateral is away from the midline. Proximal and distal. Proximal is closer to the trunk, distal is further away from the trunk. And superficial and deep. Superficial is towards the surface of a body, deep is away from the surface of a body. Once you've memorized those definitions, you also want to be able to use these words in a sentence. For example, the heart is blank to the lungs. The best word of choice here would be medial. The heart is medial to the lungs. We could flip-flop things and say the lungs are blank to the heart. The lungs are lateral to the heart. If you want to get a little fancier, you could say bilateral because technically you have two lungs, one on either side of the heart. After anatomical directions, you want to memorize the planes of the body. These are really helpful for studying the body, especially when we're doing medical scans. Things like ultrasound, CT, MRI. Those scans will often cut the body, and we need to know those planes so we know what we're looking at. First of all, you have your sagittal plane that's going to cut the body into a right and left half. If it is perfectly in the middle, we would call that mid-sagittal. How I remember this one is if I were to cut a banana in half, it would sag to right and left halves. That might not work for you, but it works for me. The frontal plane is going to cut the body at the crown of the head. Sometimes we call this the coronal plane. So it will split the body into an anterior, a front half, and posterior, the back half. Lastly, we have the transverse plane, which will split the body into superior and inferior portions. Anything that cuts the body at an angle would be considered an oblique plane. For the body cavities, we have a ventral and dorsal cavity. The dorsal cavity is the easier one to memorize because it only has two things in it: your brain and your spinal cord. So you know that saying, don't let the door hit you on the way out? If the door were to hit you, it would hit your brain and your spinal cord, your head and your back. So that's how I remember that's dorsal. Everything else is ventral. So that would include your thoracic cavity that has your mediastinum with your heart and trachea, and your pleural cavities that have your lungs. It would also include the abdominopelvic cavities that have all those abdominal structures along with the ones of the pelvis. Abdominopelvic subdivisions can be learned in two ways. We can split the abdominopelvis into quadrants or regions. Quadrants are easiest. We have a right upper, a left upper, a right lower, and a left lower. With lefts and rights in anatomy, you want to make sure you're thinking from the POV of the patient. Who cares what your POV is? We need to always be considering things from their POV. So lefts and rights are a little flip-flopped. Abdominopelvic regions are more challenging. There's 9 of them and they have some weird names. The best way to study this is to write it down again and again and again. Starting at the top, superior, we have a right hypochondriac region, an epigastric region, and a left hypochondriac region. Below that, a right lumbar region, an umbilical region, and a left lumbar region. Below that, a right iliac region, a hypogastric region, and a left iliac region. Write it down a lot of times. The body could also be split into an axial and appendicular region. The axial body is the torso, head, kind of trunk, central parts of the body. The appendicular regions of the body would be your extremities, like arms and legs. We use axial and appendicular typically to study the skeleton, which we'll get to later on. In your anatomy and physiology textbook, you'll also notice an image that probably has a lot of arrows pointing to different things on the body, giving them weird names that you might not be familiar with. They might have an arrow pointing to the back of the knee. We don't call that the back of the knee, we call that the popliteal. So whatever is labeled in your textbook, you want to study those terms. Now let's take a step back and talk big picture. The overall goal of the body is homeostasis, maintaining that relatively consistent internal environment. That is how we stay alive. We do this through 2 main mechanisms: positive feedback loops and negative feedback loops. Our best example of a positive feedback loop is the process of giving birth. So let's think about this. We've got a contraction happening. Baby's head is pushing against the cervix. There are stretch receptors in the cervix that send a signal up to the brain that say, hey, release oxytocin. Oxytocin is released, travels back down the bloodstream to the uterus, and triggers another contraction. So you can see how this process is going over and over again, getting worse and worse and worse until finally baby comes out. That is a positive feedback loop where we are sort of amplifying an effect. A negative feedback loop is the opposite of this. Our end product stops earlier production. It's almost like working at a chocolate factory. We're not making chocolate until we die, right? We'll make chocolate until we've met the supply demand. That's how our body works too. Our example we're going to use for this is the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. You don't need to memorize any of this. This is just an example so we can understand what's going on. Your hypothalamus releases TRH. TRH acts on the pituitary. The pituitary then releases TSH, which acts on the thyroid. The thyroid releases T3 and T4. These guys are for metabolism. Once we've made enough T3 and T4, we don't want to have too much. So we'll send some back up to the pituitary, back up to the hypothalamus, and we'll say, hey, stop production. That is a negative feedback loop. And there you have it. That is our basic overview of the body. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time on Vital Signs.